In a bustling courtroom, filled with the kind of tension only a high-profile case could stir, one unsuspecting moment would soon change everything. The air was thick with anticipation as a young judge, fresh-faced and eager to prove his worth, sat at the front. His robe looked almost too big for him, and his eyes were filled with an unearned confidence that many had come to know too well. He was new to this role, a symbol of the youth rising in the world of law. As the trial began, there was one figure who stood out from the crowd, an elderly woman, frail yet dignified. At first glance, she seemed like she didn't belong in this world of legal battles and heated arguments. Her silver hair, neatly tied in a bun, and the delicate spectacles perched on her nose gave her an air of quiet wisdom. But what no one knew was that this was no ordinary woman. She wasn't there as a mere observer. She was a legendary attorney who had spent decades shaping the legal landscape. Yet as the trial went on, something strange began to unfold. The young judge, still holding the weight of his first big case, grew increasingly impatient with the elderly woman. She hadn't said a word yet, but her presence seemed to frustrate him. Perhaps it was her age. Perhaps it was the way she watched everything so calmly. But whatever it was, he didn't take kindly to it. In a moment of sheer arrogance, he mocked her. He muttered under his breath about how someone so old could possibly have anything valuable to offer in this court. He smiled to himself, thinking no one had heard him. But what he didn't realize was that every word he said only fed into the growing tension in the room. It was a mistake that, at the time, seemed harmless but would have far-reaching consequences. The mocking words had barely escaped the judge's lips when the elderly woman stood up. Her movements were slow but deliberate, and the room fell into a stunned silence. All eyes were on her now. The judge, sensing that his moment of power was slipping away, tried to regain control of the situation. But the elderly woman's presence was overpowering. She had heard every word, and she wasn't about to let them slide. What happened next would shake everyone in that courtroom to their core. The woman spoke, not with the voice of someone frail, but with the authority of someone who had seen it all. Her words were sharp, every sentence carefully crafted, and as she revealed her true identity, the room seemed to hold its breath. You see, the elderly woman was not just any lawyer. She was a trailblazer, someone who had fought and won cases that shaped the very fabric of the legal system. Her name was known by every attorney, every judge, and every person who had ever stepped foot in a courtroom. She was a legend, a name that commanded respect, yet no one in that room had recognized her. She had watched quietly, observing how the justice system had changed, how younger minds like the judge in front of her could easily forget the power of experience. But what no one knew, what no one could have imagined, was that this elderly woman wasn't there just as an observer. She was there to teach a lesson. With a calm, almost gentle smile, she addressed the judge, her voice echoing in the silent room. You think you understand justice, young man, but you've only just begun to scratch the surface. The words hung in the air, and the young judge's face turned pale. He had no idea who he was dealing with. No one did. As the woman continued, the tension in the room only grew. She recounted stories from her years of practice, speaking of cases that had shaped the law, of people who had come to her in desperation, and of the countless hours spent fighting for those who had been forgotten by the system. Her words were not just a reminder of her own accomplishments, but a challenge to the young judge's understanding of what it meant to truly serve justice. She had seen it all, the good, the bad, and the ugly, and nothing had the power to faze her anymore. But the biggest surprise came when she revealed how long she had been following this particular case. She had been in the courtroom, quietly observing the young judge's every move, just waiting for the right moment to reveal herself. And now, that moment had come. She wasn't there to sit idly by. She was there to remind everyone in that room, especially the young judge, that wisdom could never be underestimated. Just when it seemed like the judge might apologize, or at least offer a semblance of respect, he did something unexpected. His face flushed with embarrassment, but then, in a moment of arrogance, he scoffed at her. He wasn't ready to admit that he had been wrong. He wasn't ready to accept the truth that she, in her quiet dignity, had been trying to teach him. The judge's reaction would set the stage for a confrontation that no one in the room could have predicted. The judge's dismissal of the elderly woman's words hung in the air like a heavy cloud. His youthful arrogance had become an almost palpable force, pushing back against the wisdom that had been laid out before him. The courtroom felt smaller, the tension growing thicker with each passing second. The attorneys, the witnesses, and even the audience seemed to hold their breath, waiting for what would happen next. In the back of the room, a few whispers began to ripple, but no one dared speak too loudly. The young judge had just made a mistake that no one could ignore. But what would he do now? As the elderly woman stood still, her eyes never leaving the judge's face, there was an almost eerie calm about her. It was as if she had already seen everything unfold before it even happened. Her entire life had been a study in patience, in waiting for the right moment to strike. And this, she knew, was her moment. But before the judge could respond, she slowly turned to address the entire courtroom. "I don't expect anyone here to understand my silence until now. I didn't come to this courtroom for recognition," she began, her voice soft yet commanding. "I came to remind you all that the law is not a game. It's not a place for ego, or pride, or youthful enthusiasm." Her words resonated in the room, touching every person present. For a brief moment, the judge's gaze softened, his defiance faltering under the weight of her statement. But the battle was far from over. The courtroom had been buzzing with excitement for weeks about this particular case. It was high profile, involving a powerful corporate entity accused of exploiting workers. Everyone had their opinions, their biases, but no one had anticipated that it would be a clash of generations. The young judge, though eager to prove himself, had come from a world where the law was more about headlines and winning cases than about seeking true justice. His ambition clouded his judgment, and in his haste to make a name for himself, he had underestimated the power of experience. The elderly woman, on the other hand, had seen it all. Her name was Emma Lawson, and her reputation in the legal community was nothing short of legendary. She had fought battles in the courtroom that had changed the course of history, cases that others had called impossible to win, cases that had made her a symbol of what it meant to fight for the voiceless. But for all her success, Emma had chosen a quieter life in recent years. She had distanced herself from the limelight, working mostly as a consultant for younger attorneys, advising them on how to approach cases that mattered. She had thought her time in the courtroom was behind her. Until now, as the trial continued, it became clear that the stakes were higher than anyone realized. The corporate giant on trial had the best lawyers money could buy, and they were prepared to do whatever it took to win. They were ruthless, they were powerful, and they knew how to manipulate the system. The workers they had exploited were just another casualty in their drive for profit. But Emma knew something that the young judge didn't. The law wasn't meant to protect the powerful. It was meant to hold them accountable. It was in this moment, as the judge and Emma locked eyes once more, that the true weight of the case became apparent. The young judge had to decide. Would he follow the path of easy victory, swayed by the influence and power of the corporation? Or would he stand with the people who had been wronged, even if it meant facing the wrath of those who controlled the legal system? Emma had no illusions about the challenges ahead. She knew that the odds were stacked against the workers, but she also knew that she couldn't just sit back and watch. This was her fight. This was her moment to show the world that true justice could still prevail, even in a courtroom stacked with wealth and corruption. But there was something more at play here, something that went beyond the case itself. Emma's presence was a challenge to the judge, to the system, and to everything he thought he knew about the law. In that moment, she wasn't just a legendary attorney. She was a force, a living testament to the power of experience and wisdom. And for the first time in his career, the judge felt a deep, unsettling doubt creep into his mind. As the day wore on, the tension in the courtroom reached a boiling point. The defense team, sensing that the judge was beginning to waver, pushed harder. They used every trick in the book to undermine the case, throwing false accusations, planting seeds of doubt, and relying on every bit of legal maneuvering to shift the balance in their favor. But Emma stood firm, countering each attack with precision, using the very system they sought to manipulate against them. The judge, though still hesitant, began to watch her closely. He had no choice now but to pay attention. Yet, despite Emma's best efforts, the pressure was building. The young judge's doubts were growing, and the case seemed to be slipping away. Emma could feel the clock ticking, each moment bringing them closer to a point of no return. The courtroom felt like a pressure cooker, each word spoken carrying the weight of 1,000 unspoken truths. It was a battle between the old and the new, between experience and ambition, between justice and corruption, and then, just as it seemed, the judge would make his final decision. Emma did something unexpected. She pulled out a file from her briefcase, a piece of evidence that could change everything. The room went silent as she placed it on the table in front of the judge. She didn't say a word. All eyes were on him now. Would he accept the truth, or would he let it slip away, bound by the chains of his own pride? As the judge slowly reached for the file, the tension in the room reached its peak. The clock was ticking, and the fate of the case, and perhaps his own future, hung in the balance. What would he do? Mine raced. He had been caught in the undertow of this battle between ambition and justice, and the weight of the decision before him was heavier than anything he had ever experienced. He glanced at the elderly woman, Emma Lawson, standing so confidently by her case. How could he have underestimated her? This wasn't just some old woman he could mock and dismiss. She was a living legend, a titan of the legal world. But it wasn't just her presence that made this moment so intense. It was the truth in the file she had placed before him. With a deep breath, the judge finally picked up the file. He could feel the stares burning into him. As he opened it, the truth began to unfold in front of him. Emma had uncovered a crucial piece of evidence, a trail of documents that tied the corporation directly to the exploitation of the workers. The proof was damning. This was not just hearsay or rumors. It was solid, irrefutable evidence that could change the course of the entire case. The judge looked up at Emma, his eyes wide. She hadn't just handed him a file. She had handed him the key to unlock the corruption that had been festering in the system for years. For the first time, the young judge realized that this wasn't just about winning a case. It was about justice, true justice, the kind that had been overshadowed by wealth and influence for far too long. But there was no turning back now. The moment had arrived. The judge could feel the pressure rising, but this time, he was ready. He knew what he had to do. With a steady hand, he banged his gavel, signaling the end of the trial and the beginning of a new chapter. The decision had been made. The corporation was guilty. The workers would receive the justice they had been denied for so long. And the judge, despite his doubts and mistakes, had chosen to stand on the side of what was right. The courtroom erupted. In disbelief, the magnitude of the ruling sinking in. Emma stood quietly, a subtle smile playing on her lips. She didn't need applause. She didn't need recognition. What mattered was, the truth had won. And that was all she had ever hoped for. As the judge looked around the room, he couldn't help but feel a sense of gratitude for Emma. She had shown him what true justice looked like. She had given him the courage to make the right call, even when it was the hardest thing to do. In that moment, the weight of the case lifted, and he realized how much he still had to learn. The tension that had gripped the courtroom slowly began to dissolve. The workers who had been wronged would finally have a voice, and the corrupt corporation would be held accountable. Emma's legacy would live on, and the young judge, though still new to this world, would carry the lessons she had imparted with him for the rest of his career. As the trial came to an end, the judge approached Emma. There was no arrogance in his stance now, no youthful bravado, only respect. He extended his hand, and she took it, her grip firm but gentle. "Thank you," he said, his voice sincere. Emma didn't reply immediately, but her eyes sparkled with an understanding that went beyond words. She didn't need to say anything. The message had been delivered. The courtroom began to empty, but the story of what had just transpired would not be forgotten. It would spread like wildfire, not just because of the historic verdict, but because of the lesson it imparted. Justice was not about power or prestige. It was about truth, integrity, and the willingness to stand up for what was right, even when it wasn't the easy path. As the doors to the courtroom closed behind them, Emma walked out, not as a legend, but as a symbol of hope, and the young judge, now a little wiser, stepped into the future with a new understanding of the law and the responsibility that came with it. The battle had been fought, and the truth had prevailed.